was just another ordinary day for Tasha Williams, a 32-year-old FBI analyst, as she drove through the quiet streets of her neighborhood. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the rows of houses and parked cars. She was on her way, home after a long day at work, her mind still buzzing with the details of a case she'd been piecing together. But what happened next would turn her evening into something she could never have imagined, a moment that would test her patience, her professionalism, and her faith in the system she'd dedicated her life to serving. As Tasha approached a stop, signs she noticed flashing lights in her rearview mirror. A police cruiser was behind her, its siren blaring. Confused, she pulled over to the side of the road, wondering what she could have possibly done wrong. She hadn't been speeding. Her tags were up to date. Her mind raced as she rolled down her window, waiting for the officer to approach. What she didn't know was that this routine traffic stop was about to take a dramatic turn, one that would leave everyone involved questioning their assumptions and their actions. The officer, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, walked up to her car. Before Tasha could even greet him, he barked, "License and registration, ma'am." His tone was sharp, almost aggressive, and it immediately put her on edge. She reached for her glove compartment, moving slowly to avoid any sudden movements that might escalate the situation. But as she handed over her documents, the officer's eyes narrowed. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. Tasha's heart skipped a beat. She knew the risks of being a black woman in this situation. She had heard the stories, seen the headlines, but she also knew her rights. And she knew who she was. As she stepped out of the car, the officer's demeanor grew more intense. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. Tasha shook her head, trying to stay calm. "No, officer, I don't," she replied, her voice steady. That's when things took a turn. The officer suddenly drew his gun, pointing it directly at her. "Hands where I can see them," he shouted. Tasha froze, her mind racing. She couldn't believe what was happening. She was being treated like a criminal, and she hadn't even been told why. But Tasha wasn't just any civilian. She reached into her pocket, her movements slow and deliberate, and pulled out her FBI badge. "Officer, I'm with the FBI," she said, holding it up for him to see. For a moment there was silence, then to her shock the officer laughed. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was mocking, dismissive. "Yeah, right," he sneered. "And I'm the president." Tasha's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was something deeper, something uglier. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the tension thick in the air. What happened next would change everything. As the officer continued to mock her, another car pulled up. This time, it was an unmarked vehicle, and the man who stepped out was someone Tasha recognized immediately. It was her supervisor, Agent Mark Harris. His presence shifted the dynamic instantly. The officer's smirk faded as Harris approached, his own badge in hand. "What's going on here?" Harris demanded, his voice firm and authoritative. The officer stammered, trying to explain himself, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Within minutes, the scene was swarming with law enforcement, both local and federal. The officer who had pulled Tasha over was now the one being questioned, his earlier confidence replaced by visible unease. Tasha stood there, watching it all unfold, her mind still processing what had just happened. She had gone from being a suspect to a witness in a matter of moments, but the story was far from over. As the officer was placed in handcuffs, Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. What had started as a routine traffic stop had spiraled into something much bigger, something that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. And as the cameras rolled and the questions began, one thing was clear. This wasn't just a story about a traffic stop gone wrong. It was a story about power, about prejudice, and about the thin line that separates justice from injustice. But what would happen next? Would the officer face consequences for his actions? Would Tasha's career be affected by the fallout? And what did this incident reveal about the broader issues at play in our society? The answers to those questions were still unclear, but one thing was certain. This was a story that would leave everyone watching on the edge of their seats, and it was far from over. As the flashing lights of the police cruisers lit up the quiet street, Tasha stood there, her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. The officer who had pulled her over was now sitting in the back of a squad car, his face pale and his earlier bravado completely gone. Agent Harris was speaking to the local police chief, his tone low but firm. Tasha could catch snippets of the conversation, words like protocol, misconduct, and internal investigation. She knew this wasn't going to be swept under the rug, not with Harris involved. He was a straight shooter, someone who believed in accountability no matter who was on the other side of the badge. But as much as Tasha wanted to feel a sense of justice, she couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. This wasn't just about one officer making a bad call. It was about the system that had allowed him to act that way in the first place. She thought about all the times she'd heard stories like this, stories of black men and women being harassed, threatened, or worse, by those who were supposed to protect them. She had always told herself that her work with the FBI was her way of making a difference, of being part of the solution. But tonight, she had been on the other side of the badge, and it had left her feeling vulnerable in a way she hadn't expected. Harris walked over to her, his expression a mix of concern and frustration. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer. "Now." Tasha nodded, though she wasn't sure if she meant it. "Yeah, I'm fine," she said, her eyes drifting back to the squad car where the officer sat. I can't believe this happened." Harris followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. "Neither can I," he said. "But we're going to get to the bottom of it. I promise you that." As the night wore on, more details began to emerge. The officer's name was Greg Morrison, a 15-year veteran of the force. He had a record, nothing major, but enough to raise eyebrows. A few complaints from civilians over the years, mostly about his attitude and aggressive behavior, but nothing had ever stuck. He'd been reprimanded a couple of times, given a slap on the wrist, and sent back out on the streets. Tasha couldn't help but wonder how many other people had been on the receiving end of his bad judgment, how many others had been too afraid to speak up. Harris had already started digging into Morrison's history, pulling files and making calls. Tasha knew he wouldn't stop until he had answers. But there was something else bothering her, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Why had Morrison pulled her over in the first place? She hadn't been speeding. Her car wasn't suspicious. Was it just a case of racial profiling, or was there more to it? As she sat in the passenger seat of Harris's car, waiting for him to finish up with the local cops, Tasha's mind kept circling back to that moment when Morrison had laughed at her badge. It wasn't just the disrespect that got to her. It was the way he had dismissed her so easily, as if her credentials meant nothing. It was a reminder that, no matter how high she climbed in her career, there were still people who would never see her as anything more than a black woman, and that realization stung more than she wanted to admit. Harris finally got back in the car, his face grim. "We've got a problem," he said, handing her a file. Tasha opened it, her eyes scanning the pages. It was a report on Morrison, but it wasn't just about his history with the police department. There were notes about his connections, people he associated with, places he frequented. And then there was the name that jumped out at her. Marcus Reed. Tasha's breath caught in her throat. Marcus Reed was a name she knew all too well. He was a mid-level drug dealer who had been on the FBI's radar for months. They had been building a case against him, but he was slippery, always one step ahead. And now, according to the file, Morrison had been seen meeting with Reed on multiple occasions. Tasha looked up at Harris, her mind racing. "You think Morrison's dirty?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Harris nodded, his expression serious. "It's looking that way," he said. "But we need more evidence before we can make any moves. If Morrison's working with Reed, this goes way beyond a traffic stop. This could be a major breach of trust within the department." The weight of what Harris was saying settled over Tasha like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about corruption, about a system that had failed not just her, but countless others. And if Morrison was involved with Reed, it meant there were others, cops, maybe even higher-ups, who were in on it too. The thought sent a chill down her spine. Harris started the car, pulling away from the scene. "We need to be careful," he said, his eyes on the road. "If Morrison's connected to Reed, he's not going to go down without a fight. And if he finds out we're onto him..." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Tasha knew what he was thinking. They were walking into dangerous territory, and one wrong move could cost them everything. As they drove through the quiet streets, Tasha couldn't help but think about what had brought her to this moment. She had joined the FBI because she believed in justice, in making a difference. But now she was facing a reality that was far more complicated than she had ever imagined. This wasn't just about catching bad guys. It was about navigating a world where the lines between right and wrong were often blurred, where the people who were supposed to protect you could just as easily turn on you. Harris pulled up to her apartment building, putting the car in park. "Get some rest," he said, his tone softer now. "We'll pick this up in the morning, and Tasha, be careful. If Morrison's as dirty as we think he is, he's not going to take this lying down." Tasha nodded, stepping out of the car. She watched as Harris drove off, the taillights disappearing into the night. As she walked up to her apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, but the street was empty. Still, the unease lingered. Inside her apartment, Tasha locked the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment as she tried to steady her breathing. She knew this was far from over. Morrison was just the tip of the iceberg. If he was working with Reed, it meant there was a whole network of corruption they had yet to uncover, and if they were going to take it down, they would need to be smarter, faster, and more careful than ever before. But as Tasha sat down on her couch, her mind kept drifting back to that moment on the street. The look on Morrison's face when he realized who she was. It wasn't just fear she had seen in his eyes. It was something else, something darker. And it left her with a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger, much more dangerous. The question was, how far was she willing to go to uncover the truth? And what would it cost her in the end? The answers were still out of reach, but one thing was certain. The stakes had never been higher, and the game was just getting started. Next morning, Tasha woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. She groaned, reaching for it, her mind still foggy from the restless night. The screen lit up with a string of messages from Harris. "Call me ASAP," the first one read. The others were more urgent, each one ramping up the tension. Tasha sat up, her heart pounding as she dialed his number. Whatever this was, it couldn't wait. Harris picked up on the first ring. "We've got a situation," he said, his voice tight. "Morrison's gone." Tasha's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, gone?" she asked, already dreading the answer. "He was released last night," Harris explained. "Internal Affairs said they didn't have enough to hold him, and now he's disappeared. No one's seen him since." Tasha's mind raced. If Morrison was on the run, it only confirmed their suspicions. He was hiding something big. And if he was connected to Marcus Reed, this was about to get a whole lot messier. Harris didn't waste any time. "Meet me at the office in 30, he said. "We need to move fast." Tasha was already out of bed, pulling on clothes and grabbing her badge and gun. She didn't know what they were walking into, but she knew one thing. They couldn't let Morrison slip away. Not now. Not when they were so close. By the time she got to the FBI office, Harris was already in the conference room, surrounded by files and maps. He looked up as she walked in, his expression grim. "We've got a lead," he said, pointing to a map of the city. "Morrison's car was spotted near the docks last night. If he's meeting Reed, that's where it'll go. Down." Tasha nodded, her eyes scanning the map. The docks were a known hotspot for drug trafficking, a place where deals were made and lives were lost. If Morrison was there, it wasn't just a coincidence. But as they started to plan their next move, Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why would Morrison risk going to the docks so soon after being released? It didn't make sense. Unless he was trying to send a message, or worse, set a trap. She voiced her concerns to Harris, who nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "This could be a setup, but we don't have a choice. If we wait, we lose him, and if he's working with Reed, we can't afford to let that happen." The team moved quickly, assembling a small task force to head to the docks. Tasha and Harris were in the lead car, their nerves on edge as they drove through the early morning fog. The docks were quiet, the only sound the distant hum of machinery, and the occasional cry of a seagull. But as they got closer, Tasha could feel the tension in the air. Something wasn't right. They parked a few blocks away, moving in on foot to avoid drawing attention. The plan was simple: get in, find Morrison, and bring him in, alive if possible. But as they approached the warehouse where Morrison's car had been spotted, Tasha's instincts kicked in. She held up a hand, signaling for the team to stop. "Wait," she whispered, her eyes scanning the area. There were too many shadows, too many places for someone to hide. This wasn't just a meeting. This was an ambush. Before she could say anything else, the sound of footsteps echoed through the empty street. Tasha's hand went to her gun, her heart pounding in her chest. But it wasn't Morrison who stepped out of the shadows. It was Marcus Reed himself, flanked by two armed men. Tasha's breath caught in her throat. This was worse than she had imagined. Reed smirked, his eyes locking onto hers. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Look who decided to join the party." Tasha didn't respond, her mind racing. This wasn't just about Morrison anymore. This was about Reed, and he wasn't going to let them walk away without a fight. Harris stepped forward, his gun drawn. "It's over, Reed," he said, his voice steady. "You're surrounded." But Reed just laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent a chill down Tasha's spine. "You think this is over?" he said, his smirk widening. "You have no idea what you're walking into." Before anyone could react, the sound of engines roared to life, and suddenly the street was filled with cars, their headlights blinding. Tasha shielded her eyes, her heart pounding as she realized what was happening. This wasn't just Reed, this was his entire crew, and they were outnumbered. Harris shouted for the team to take cover, but it was too late. The first shot rang out, and chaos erupted. Tasha dove behind a parked car, her gun in hand as bullets whizzed past her. She could hear Harris shouting orders, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of gunfire and the screech of tires. This wasn't just a confrontation. This was a war. As the firefight raged on, Tasha's mind raced. They were outgunned, outmanned, and running out of time. But she couldn't let Reed win. Not after everything he'd done. Not after everything she'd been through. She peeked out from behind the car, her eyes scanning the chaos for any sign of Morrison. If he was here, he was the key to taking Reed down, but he was nowhere to be seen. The sound of a car engine revving caught her attention, and she turned just in time to see a black SUV speeding away from the scene. Her heart sank. Morrison. He was getting away. And if he did, they might never get another chance to stop him or Reed. Tasha made a split-second decision. She couldn't let Morrison escape. Not now. Not when they were so close. She shouted to Harris, telling him she was going after the SUV. He nodded, his face grim, and she took off running, her legs pumping as she chased after the disappearing taillights. But as she ran, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was exactly what Reed wanted. To divide them, to weaken them. And as the sound of gunfire faded behind her, she realized she was alone. Completely alone. And the stakes had never been higher. The SUV turned a corner, disappearing into the maze of streets near the docks. Tasha followed, her breath coming, in short gasps as she pushed herself to keep going. She didn't know what she would do when she caught up to Morrison. She didn't even know if she could. But she knew one thing. She couldn't let him get away. Not after everything he'd done. Not after everything he represented. As she rounded the corner, the SUV came into view again, parked in front of an abandoned warehouse. Tasha slowed down, her hand tightening on her gun as she approached. The driver's side door was open, but there was no sign of Morrison. Her heart pounded as she stepped inside the warehouse, her eyes scanning the dark, empty space. She could hear the sound of footsteps echoing somewhere in the distance, but she couldn't tell where they were coming from. "Morrison!" she shouted, her voice echoing off the walls. "It's over! Come out!" But there was no response, just the sound of her own breathing and the faint creak of the old building settling around her. And then, out of nowhere, a voice. Cold, mocking, and all too familiar. "You really think you can stop me?" it said. Tasha spun around, her gun raised. But there was no one there. Just shadows, and the sinking feeling that she was walking into a trap. The voice came again, closer this time. "You're in over your head, Tasha," it said. "You always were." She recognized it now. It wasn't Morrison. It was Reed. He was here, and he wasn't alone. Tasha's mind raced as she tried to figure out her next move. She was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and running out of options. But she couldn't give up. Not now. Not when the truth was so close. As she took a step forward, the sound of a gun being cocked echoed through the warehouse. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment of truth. And whatever happened next, she knew one thing. The game was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. Tasha's breath hitched as the sound of the gun being cocked reverberated through the empty warehouse. Her grip tightened on her own weapon, her knuckles white as she scanned the shadows for any sign of movement. The voice, Reed's voice, had come from somewhere to her left, but the echo made it impossible to pinpoint his exact location. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, her boots barely making a sound on the concrete floor. Every nerve in her body was on high alert, her instincts screaming at her to stay sharp. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. This was a fight for survival. "You really think you can walk out of here, Tasha?" Reed's voice taunted, closer now. She could almost feel his presence, like a predator circling its prey. "You're in my world now. And in my world, people like you don't make it out alive." Tasha didn't respond. She couldn't afford to. Every word, every breath had to be calculated. She knew Reed was trying to rattle her, to throw her off balance, but she couldn't let him win. Not like this. Her eyes darted to the far corner of the warehouse where a faint glimmer of light seeped through a cracked window. If she could make it there, she might have a chance. But getting there meant crossing open ground, and Reed wasn't going to make that easy. She took another step, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. And then, out of nowhere, a shot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off the metal beam just inches from her head. Tasha dropped to the ground, rolling behind a stack of wooden crates for cover. Her chest heaved as she tried to steady her breathing. Reed wasn't playing games anymore. "Come on, Tasha," Reed called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "You're not gonna hide forever. Let's make this interesting." Tasha clenched her jaw, her mind racing. She couldn't stay here. She had to move. But every option felt like a death sentence. If she stayed put, Reed would eventually flush her out. If she ran, she'd be an easy target. And if she fought back, well, she was outnumbered and outgunned. But she didn't have a choice. She had to try. With a deep breath, she peeked out from behind the crates, her eyes scanning the dimly lit space. She could see movement near the far wall, shadows shifting, footsteps echoing. Reed wasn't alone. He had at least 2 men with him, maybe more, and they were closing in. Tasha's mind raced as she tried to come up with a plan. She needed to even the odds, and fast. Her hand brushed against something on the ground, a loose piece of metal pipe. It wasn't much, but it was something. She grabbed it, her fingers wrapping around the cold steel. If she could create a distraction, she might be able to buy herself enough time to make a move. She just had to time it right. Tasha took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. She had one shot. She hurled the pipe across the warehouse, the clatter echoing loudly as it skidded across the floor. For a split second, there was silence. And then, chaos erupted. Shots rang out, the bullets tearing through the air as Reed and his men turned their attention to the noise. Tasha didn't waste a second. She bolted from her hiding spot, sprinting toward the far corner of the warehouse. Her legs burned as she pushed herself to move faster. Her eyes locked on the faint glimmer of light ahead, but she didn't make it far. A figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking her path. It was one of Reed's men, his gun raised and aimed directly at her. Tasha skidded to a stop, her heart pounding as she raised her own weapon. They stood there for a moment, locked in a deadly standoff. Neither of them moved, neither of them blinked. And then, the sound of a gunshot shattered the silence. Tasha flinched, her body bracing for impact. But the bullet didn't hit her. The man in front of her crumpled to the ground, a look of shock frozen on his face. Tasha spun around, her eyes wide as she saw Harris standing in the doorway, his gun still smoking. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said it all. They were in this together, and they weren't going down without a fight. But before Tasha could react, the sound of footsteps echoed behind her. She turned just in time to see Reed emerging from the shadows, a cold smile on his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Looks like the party's just getting started." Tasha's heart sank as she realized what was happening. Reed wasn't just here for her, he was here for Harris too, and he wasn't going to let either of them walk away. Harris stepped forward, his gun trained on Reed. "It's over," he said, his voice steady. "You're done." But Reed just laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent a chill down Tasha's spine. "You really think it's that simple?" he said, his smirk widening. "You have no idea what's coming." Before anyone could react, the sound of engines roared to life outside the warehouse. Tasha's heart pounded as she realized what was happening. Reed had called for backup, and they were about to be surrounded. Harris grabbed Tasha's arm, pulling her toward the exit. "We need to move, now," he said, his voice urgent. Tasha didn't argue. She followed him, her legs pumping as they sprinted toward the door. But as they reached the exit, a figure stepped into their path. It was Morrison, his face pale and his eyes wild. He looked like a man who had nothing left to lose. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice shaking as he raised his gun. Tasha's heart sank as she realized what was happening. Morrison wasn't just a pawn in Reed's game. He was a desperate man, willing to do whatever it took to survive. And that made him dangerous. Harris stepped forward, his gun still trained on Morrison. "Put it down, Greg," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This doesn't have to end like this." But Morrison didn't budge. His hands were trembling, his eyes darting between Harris and Tasha. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't have a choice. He made me do it. He made me..." Before he could finish, the sound of gunfire erupted behind them. Tasha spun around, her heart pounding as she saw Reed and his men closing in. They were trapped, and there was no way out. Harris grabbed Tasha's arm, pulling her behind a stack of crates for cover. "We need to think fast," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We can't let them take us, not like this." Tasha nodded, her mind racing as she tried to come up with a plan, but the odds were stacked against them. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. As the sound of footsteps grew closer, Tasha's heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the moment of truth. And whatever happened next, she knew one thing. The stakes had never been higher. The fight was far from over. Tasha crouched behind the stack of crates, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, and she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Harris was beside, his jaw clenched and his eyes scanning the room for any way out. But there was none. They were trapped, surrounded by Reed's men on one side and Morrison on the other. The air was thick with tension, every second stretching into an eternity as they waited for the inevitable. And then, just as the first of Reed's men rounded the corner, a deafening explosion rocked the warehouse. Tasha's ears rang as the force of the blast sent her sprawling to the ground. Smoke filled the air, obscuring her vision as she struggled to get her bearings. She could hear shouting, the sound of footsteps scrambling in every direction. What the hell had just happened? Harris grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. "We need to move!" he shouted over the chaos. Tasha didn't argue. She followed him, her heart pounding as they stumbled through the smoke. The explosion had created a diversion, but it had also thrown everything into disarray. Reed's men were scattered, their shouts echoing through the warehouse as they tried to figure out what was going on. Tasha didn't know who had set off the explosion, but she wasn't about to waste the opportunity. As they reached the far side of the warehouse, Tasha caught a glimpse of movement near the exit. It was Morrison, his face pale and his eyes wide with panic. He was clutching his side, blood seeping through his fingers. He looked like a man who had just realized he was in way over his head. Tasha hesitated for a moment, her instincts warring with her anger. He had betrayed everything they stood for, but he was also a human being, a desperate, broken man who had been used by Reed. She couldn't just leave him there. Harris seemed to read her mind. "We don't have time for this," he said, his voice tight. But Tasha shook her head. "We can't leave him," she said, her voice firm. "He knows things we need." Harris hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, but make it quick." Tasha moved toward Morrison, her gun still in hand. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with fear and regret. "I didn't want this," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't want any of this." Tasha crouched beside him, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of Reed or his men. "Then help us," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Tell us what you know. Where's Reed going? What's his plan?" Morrison opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, a shot rang out. Tasha flinched, her body instinctively shielding Morrison as she turned toward the source of the gunfire. It was Reed, standing in the doorway with a cold, calculating smile on his face. "You really think he's going to help you?" Reed said, his voice dripping with mockery. "He's just as much a pawn as you are." Tasha's heart sank as she realized what was happening. Reed wasn't just here to take them out. He was here to send a message, and Morrison was part of that message. Before she could react, Reed raised his gun and fired again. This time the bullet hit its mark. Morrison's body jerked as the shot tore through him, his eyes wide with shock before he slumped to the ground, lifeless. Tasha's breath caught in her throat, her mind reeling from what had just happened. Reed had killed Morrison in cold blood right in front of her, and now he was turning his attention to her and Harris. "You're next," he said, his voice cold and unfeeling. "But don't worry, I'll make it quick." Harris grabbed Tasha's arm, pulling her to her feet. "We need to go now," he said, his voice urgent. But Tasha couldn't move. She was frozen, her eyes locked on Morrison's lifeless body. This wasn't just about taking down Reed anymore. This was personal, and she wasn't going to let him win. As Reed stepped closer, his gun trained on them. Tasha's mind raced. They were out of options, out of time. And then, out of nowhere, the sound of sirens filled the air. Reed's smile faltered as he turned toward the sound, his eyes narrowing. "Cops," he muttered, his voice filled with disdain. Perfect timing. Tasha didn't waste a second. She grabbed Harris's arm, pulling him toward the exit. "Let's go," she shouted, her voice filled with urgency. They sprinted toward the door, their legs burning as they pushed themselves to move. Faster. Behind them, Reed's men were scrambling, their shouts echoing through the warehouse as they tried to figure out what to do. But Tasha didn't look back. She couldn't. She had to keep moving. As they burst out of the warehouse, the sight of flashing lights and police cars greeted them. The cops had arrived, but Tasha knew it wasn't over. Reed wasn't going to let them walk away that easily. And as she and Harris ducked behind a squad car for cover, she realized something else. This wasn't just about Reed anymore. There was something bigger going on, something darker, and they were only just beginning to scratch the surface. Harris turned to her, his face grim. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice low, "before Reed makes his move." Tasha nodded, her mind racing. They had survived the warehouse, but the fight was far from over. And as the sound of gunfire erupted behind them, she knew one thing. The stakes had never been higher, and the truth was closer than ever. But at what cost? The sirens grew louder, the chaos around them escalating as Reed's men clashed with the police. Tasha's heart pounded as she tried to make sense of it all. Who had called the cops? And why now? It didn't make sense. Unless someone else was pulling the strings. Someone who had been watching this whole time. Waiting for the right moment to strike. As the pieces began to fall into place, Tasha's stomach churned. This wasn't just about Reed or Morrison. This was about something much bigger. And as she and Harris made their way to safety, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. One that had been set long before they even knew the game had begun. The night was far from over, and the fight was just getting started.